The evolution of digitalization is changing how multinationals operate and relate with foreign governments. It's also raising questions about taxation in the digital economy. There have been debates over the last few years about how the standard international tax system needs to properly capture the expanding reach of digitalization. The amount of revenue generated by multinational companies leveraging digital technologies and platforms has shown that value can be created with little or no physical presence, as long as there are consumers for these services. This scenario entitles foreign governments to impose varying taxes on revenues drawn by multinational companies from local consumers. Today on Taxing Africa, in partnership with the West African Tax Administration Forum, we're looking at African economies and the OECD's two-pillar solution. Is it a one-size-fits-all, or can we also gain? Now, joining me is Emmanuel, international tax lawyer and senior tax advisor for the ICRICT, a UK-based think tank focused on the reform of international corporate taxation. Emmanuel was also an integral member of the Nigerian contingent to the ongoing negotiations on the rules to tax digital economy. Emmanuel, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Hello, Africa. Nice to be here.
So let's talk tax. I think second to death, it's probably the only other thing that is certain in life. And many say it's also as old as society. But why then do we see a lot of this buzz, a lot of the noise that's coming around when it comes to taxing the digital economy? Why can't we just tax digital businesses the same way we've been taxing other businesses?
Thank you very much. I think you said it all in the introductory section. Before the advent of technology, multinational enterprises did businesses in other jurisdictions by establishing physical presence, some sort of physical presence. It could be shops, it could be business establishment like factories. But following the advent of technology, you now have the world's biggest multinationals being able to do businesses across different jurisdictions without need to have physical presence. The issue now is that the rule to tax all multinationals are built based on physical presence. And for these reasons, these multinationals who make monies from different jurisdictions, especially markets like African countries, they are not being effectively taxed by the existing international tax infrastructure. And it became necessary for countries to now talk about how to rejig the rules to effectively tax these digital businesses. And that's why they cannot be taxed like the brick and mortar businesses, because unlike the brick and mortar businesses who have shops in our countries we can go to require for tax, they do not have physical presence, and they make more money from our economies more than even the ones with physical presence. Yes.
From that, because yes, this is yet another form of tax because the world has moved forward. But then it begs the question, why must we all come together to enforce this tax? Because one of the issues that Kenya and Nigeria have had is that their own tax rate for these digital companies or this digital taxation is much higher, would supposedly make them more money than the tax rates that the OECD has been pushing. So when we look at that, comparing to the needs of African economies, particularly when it comes to tax revenue, must we join the bandwagon? What do you think?
Well, my answer would be it depends. And there's a whole lot that countries can do to effectively tax digital enterprises, or what you call the digital economy. And I have always insisted that one, it starts from acquiring the capacity. Our countries across Africa, we need to build capacity in international tax, especially related to taxation of digital economy. You also need to upgrade the tax administrative tools. These businesses are now digital, so you need to digitize your processes so as to capture a lot of some of this revenue. Then you also need to set your rules properly. Tax is law, and law is tax. So the tax must be backed up by the rules. So you need to set your rules domestically. You need to reform your tax laws to block possible loopholes. And when it comes to the setting of the new rules, you have options. You could join in multilateral actions, the type of which is being advocated by the OECD, or as you pointed out, you can have other options within your domain. But the key issue to be pointed out is that the tax challenges of the digital economy is a multilateral challenge that can't be effectively solved by unilateral measures. But when multilateral actions becomes impossible, I think our countries will have to look at our domestic policy framework to see what we could do. And that is in line with what Kenya and Nigeria have sought to do by introducing some sort of rules that sought to claw back some of the revenue leakages arising from the application of the old rules to the new businesses. And to be very frank to you, it's been said that the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 may not yield enough revenue for our countries to warm up to it. And this is more so one of the reasons why Nigeria did not endorse, according to the then Minister of Finance, Nigeria did not endorse the OECD October 2021 statement.
Okay, and you're actually leading me to my next question, because it was really around, in terms of Pillar 1 and 2, the impact that we should expect them to have for African economies. But as you're saying now, it may not really have as much of an impact. It may not be as much as we're also looking for when it comes to this conversation around digital taxation. So is there then a workaround? You've talked about the fact, of course, that Kenya and Nigeria were also presenting alternative avenues or alternative methods and conversation. But if we're right back to this at the end of the day, it's very likely we're going to sign. I think Kenya has removed their objection and Nigeria is still in the negotiating process. We're just going to sign to get what little we can. That doesn't work for our economies in the long run. Is there any other option? And Emmanuel, I asked that to also ask this, because we've seen that African countries have been advocating for the UN, the United Nations, to take a greater role in global tax policy. But we've heard from the European Union and the US, which have warned that this parallel work, if you get the UN involved and then you still have the OECD involved, you have this parallel work happening. So in terms of the UN, Africa, OECD, European Union, do we feel safer with the UN? Do we think that our interests would be more put on the table if the UN was brought in on this global tax conversation?
Thank you very much for that question. As a matter of fact, the African group is leading the charge in pushing for and insisting that a framework be established at the level of UN for tax policy negotiation at international level. And one of the reasons that have been adduced for this move is lack of inclusivity at the OECD-led inclusive framework, who is leading the work on Pillar 1 and the Pillar 2. Truth be said, there are rationales behind this move, and the African group believe, and I believe as a person, that if you establish a framework at the UN, it will take into consideration the interests of developing countries vis-a-vis hearing their voices, taking their peculiarities along, and ensuring that the rules that are produced are more inclusive, more equitable, and also more simple to implement by African countries. And then you spoke about what options there may be for our countries in Africa. At ICRICT, we believe that countries are sovereign, and as sovereigns, they have rights to set their domestic tax policies. And one of the options which could be available for them, we are still advocating for fractional apportionment, which some of the elements have been adopted in the development of Pillar 1 Amount A. We are also advocating for alternative minimum taxes at country levels. If you set your alternative minimum tax and ensure that you tax income derived from your jurisdiction at 15% effective tax rate, you will have no top-up taxes to be collected by other jurisdictions. Because by the design of Pillar 2, if countries were not to tax income derived from their jurisdiction to 15% effective tax rate, whatever balance that remains from the actual amount applied and 15% will be taxed by the countries where this MNEs originally come from, or the countries of the ultimate parent entity. So these issues are considerations and discussion which we must have. We support fully the move at the UN to have that framework because there's a lot of problems it could solve for African countries. We also know that recent developments have shown that even the European Union are not going to oppose that move. And hopefully something fundamental and significant comes out from the ongoing negotiation and discussion.
All right, and you're taking me to my last question, because you've talked about, of course, the parent country, because this deal has really been criticized as a deal of the rich. And some have said it's very clear that there's a clear bias in favor of the countries where the multinational corporations have their headquarters, with flags being raised that this is a very unhealthy international principle that the headquarter country should get the lion's share of the tax income. So, Emmanuel, I ask this. It's very likely we're going to see this signed in the next few weeks. We actually had a conversation with the representative of the OECD about a year ago as we saw this continue to gather more steam. If African countries, any of us, decide to say, you know what, we're not signing on to this, we're going to maintain our own level of digital taxation, maybe in Nigeria, Kenya, maintaining that 15%, what are the consequences, do you think, of not being on board with the OECD's plan? Are there any consequences that could really stop us from deciding to be more sovereign and go our own way?
Like I mentioned in my previous answer, every country have a sovereign. As a sovereign country, you have rights to make your decisions. And part of that right is your decision to join a multilateral agreement to implement a set rule. It is also your decision not to join as well. So I don't believe that countries should be willing to join the rules if they see them as not favoring them. And if I had time to unpack the rules, you will start to understand that Pillar 1 Amount A, which is targeted at businesses without taxing businesses without fiscal presence in our jurisdiction, covers only about 100 MNEs. How many of those 100 MNEs are doing businesses in Africa? What is the quantum of revenue that we could derive from taxing those few that are in scope? So part of the challenge that developing countries had about the rule is that the scope is very narrow. So on one hand, you are asked that you can only tax 100 MNEs, and on the other hand, you are asked not to do anything about the other thousands of MNEs who do not have threshold up to 20 billion euros. So that is for Pillar 1. When you talk about Pillar 2, Pillar 2 threshold is for the globe rule is set at 750 million euros. So the scope is still limited. And there's a lot of exemptions, the sub-time-based income exclusions and other exemptions which will narrow the revenue that ordinarily should come to us to a very minimal amount. So actually, in terms of revenue, Africa do not have much to gain from the two pillars. However, like I have said, do nothing is not an option for Pillar 2, because by the rule design, if you choose to do nothing, all the amount that you left on the table, which is the difference between the actual tax you are collecting effectively from these MNEs and the amount which will make it up to 50% effective tax rate, will be collected by the jurisdiction of the ultimate parent entities. Because the way the rule is designed, the income inclusion rule is the primary rule. And that rule effectively strengthens the hand of the ultimate parent entity jurisdiction to tax income that you do not tax. But the important thing to note is that if by amendment to your domestic rules, you are able to tax effectively to 15%, no tax will leave your jurisdiction. You would have protected your tax base and retained all the taxes that you could possibly have taxed in the hand of that MNE. But there's a challenge, because the base erosion and profit shifting scheme continue to exist. So where these MNEs shift profit and declare little or no income, you still will not have much to tax. And that's why we are advocating for holistic reforms. We are advocating for alternative minimum tax measures, which will take care of some of these loopholes and ensure that taxes are applied at the appropriate rate of 15% each year. Thank you.
All right. And of course, it's not over just yet. The negotiations are on, even though there is expectation of the signing to come in probably the next few weeks. So, Emmanuel, I know we'll be talking to you again, and we'll see how things play out and how much of a voice and representation African economies will have in the final say of all of this. Emmanuel Eze, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you.